Okay, so remote AF or the remote agility framework as it's known in polite circles. Uh, Basically what this is an evolution to what we know about making organisations effective in an office or a distributed space. So it's taking a lot of the lessons we've had from working with co-located and distributed teams, and then basically putting a wrapper for remote first working over the top of it. It's not necessarily designed as a framework for sort of like a holistic framework that you roll out. It can be used like that. What we're trying to do with it is make it modular and also make it extensible. So there'll be patterns here that will be useful. For some organisations, all the patterns will be useful, but there will be patterns for teams, or there'll be patterns for teams of teams, or there'll be patterns at an enterprise level that are useful that you can use in a modular context. Basically, the whole thing's built around the premise that the capital is shifting in the market at the moment. It's shifting to tools that are making remote working more effective because COVID-19s are forcing function for innovation. And that capital is going to forever change the landscape of work, regardless of whether we want to go back to what we used to do or not. Most of the surveys I'm seeing at the moment, you've probably got 10 to 20% of workforces that are interested in going back to the office full time after this. There's a large proportion of people who want to stay remote full time, and there's a proportion in the middle who want to go back on sort of 1 or 2 days a week, but then stay close to home and family for the rest of the week. So yeah, I'll jump into a bit of the why. I've talked about the kind of the commercial and the environmental drivers for this that led us down the path, but there's a little bit more to this. And then I'm going to go through what the framework is. I'll talk about some of the teaming model aspects of it. I'll talk about team of teams and operating model design and how we do that in a remote context. I'll talk about remote governance and how you build governance frameworks that are effective in a remote setting. We'll look at a concept called the virtual obeyer, which is a digital version of an obeyer room that many of you might have used in your organisations in the past. I'll touch briefly on remote strategy, and then I'll talk about what's next, and then I'm going to hopefully get time to do some Q&A. Apologies, this is going to be unidirectional for a bit. I've just got to get through this content so we can have a good chat. All right, so the first thing here, why do we want to do this? Look, the image that I've got stuck in my mind at the moment is there's a photo that was taken in Kathmandu in Nepal this week. And it's the first time in living memory that you can see Mount Everest from Kathmandu because the pollution in the air has dropped so significantly over the last little while. I've been trying to build sustainability into what I do for a while. Elaborate's been about how do we create amazing workplaces that do things that kind of didn't feel possible in the past. Remote AF is about that plus sustainability and kind of creating a more environmentally friendly and socially just working environment. So you kind of look, when I look at this slide here, I'm not going to read it out because there's a fair bit on there and you can all look at it. But we've got kind of environmental benefits that we can unlock through remote working. We've got social benefits that we can unlock through remote working. And we've got commercial benefits that we can unlock through remote working. But each of those presents some challenges. And what we're trying to do with remote AF, and we're talking to a lot of people at the moment in a lot of really interesting and different contexts to try and work some of these things out. But from an environmental perspective, energy density in offices is actually pretty good. So we need to make sure that by moving remote, we're not creating a problem by solving one. And we need to make sure that I suppose that the responsibility for clean energy doesn't move off the corporate balance sheet and onto the personal balance sheet of workers. From a social perspective, not everyone has a great home environment to work in. We've been talking to some family violence experts over the last sort of week, and one of the things, last couple of weeks, and one of the things they're telling us is that the perpetrators of domestic violence have more control than they've ever had at the moment, because the victims are confined to their houses. You've got rental environments where it's quite difficult to get a quiet place to work sometimes. And I was talking to HSBC in Hong Kong last week, and in places where you've got smaller occupancies, it's quite difficult to find space to work remotely in a shoebox apartment and that kind of thing. So we've got to find ways to lift up the conversation with people around the home environment, and do that in a safe way that doesn't cause harm. And the final one, the commercial benefits are great, but a lot of people rely on looking over people's shoulders as a form of leadership, and remote working, particularly in operations teams, we're finding is leading to a perceived loss of visibility and control. So that could be a barrier to long-term remote working. There's also some learned helplessness aspects that we need to help teams to get over. And we also need to solve the problem of connection. So basically what we're saying here is that there's huge benefits. And this, by rolling out a framework rather than a set of services, I feel like we can have really significant global impact with this framework. But in order to have that impact, we need to make sure that we solve those problems. So introducing the framework itself, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. If you've worked with scaled agility frameworks in the past, most of these patterns will be pretty familiar to you. We've got a team at the bottom layer. We've got a team of teams that is a collection of teams that's organized around some sort of purpose. And we've got the enterprise, which is a group of teams that is trying to do something. At the team level, we've been really explicit about the fact that there are different, I suppose, operating models for teams. There's a fairly big body of work around this, and there's some really interesting stuff emerging. Simon Wardley's Pioneers, Settlers, Town Planners model is really interesting, as is his doctrine. There's a bit of a reference in here to stuff that I've learnt from Dave Snowden over the years around domain transitions in Cynefin and the nature of problems and how things flow through life cycles from innovation through to operations. There's a little bit of stuff from Kent Beck's 3X in there. And we're also looking at Jay Bloom's 3 industries model, which is looking really interesting. And Matt Skelton and Manuel Pace's team topologies. So there's a bunch of sort of stuff emerging, but the main message there is that you can't pretend that different teams that don't need to be operated differently. So they need to be funded differently. They need to be led differently. They need probably different talent. They need different learning programs. They need to organise around the work differently. Operations teams tend to have a lot of unplanned work, whereas mission teams kind of create their own work and they work to strategy rather than working to a defined roadmap. So what we're trying to do here is help teams to understand that the nature of the work should drive the operating model and the team design, and that the nature of the work also should sort of define the stuff that sits around the team and makes it effective.